Hello and welcome, everyone. We are pleased to have you here today for an interview with Steve Fredlund. My name is Mary and I'm with Twinflower Books. We are an independent bookstore that serves the Chisago Lakes in the St. Croix River Valley in Minnesota. And we like to support our local authors, but also authors in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So today you're going to hear from Steve, a lifelong people pleaser who developed a deep internal dependence on external validation. Even after discovering this, however, he spent decades continuing to do what made other people happy and willing to take the steps needed to define and live the life he truly wanted. Now, at the age of 53, Steve knows what it takes to do the unright thing and to follow his passions and to not let his need for validation to pull him back into a life focused on meeting the expectations of others. And so we're very pleased to have him here today to share with us his memoir, Do the Unright Thing, Memoir of a People Pleaser. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you, Mary. That was generous. Thanks for the opportunity.
So tell us a little bit about this young man, this younger version of yourself, the people pleaser.
I think I was 9 years old at the time. I actually had a different last name at the time. That was before I was adopted. And that little guy there, you can see the bowl cut going on there, and I was scared to death. Right, I had my school photo taken, scared to death. You could just see that in my face. But yeah, he was a little guy, just always never felt like he fit in, never felt confident, very insecure, and so all of that translated into, well, I'm going to make my identity. I'm going to try to always just please everybody else. If people like me, if they're happy with me, then maybe they won't pick on me. Maybe they'll be nicer to me. And I think that was part of that story that kind of ingrained this idea of putting everybody else in front of myself.
So when I was reading your memoir, you do share some details of growing up that I think a lot of us can relate to. I think especially about the middle school years. I can remember pulling my middle school yearbook out just briefly, seeing some comments and quickly putting it away. So I just reading the memoir, it made me wonder how you decide what stories to include in a memoir.
It was hard because you don't realize how many stories you have and how much life you've lived until you start trying to recall all of the stories. And there was a lot of stories that I originally had kind of outlined that I was going to put in there. And then some of them, frankly, the editor said, it's a really good story, it's a really fun story, but it doesn't really support the overall point of the book. And so it really ended up being a weeding out process to figure out which are those stories that actually advance the overall message of me being a people pleaser, of me putting other people first. So that was part of it. But yeah, there were some really good stories that I kind of went back and forth with on the editor, like, but I love that story. People think it's hilarious. I'm like, yeah, and they're like, it is hilarious, but the problem is it doesn't really support the book. And from a reader's perspective, you don't want to add that confusion where people are like, why am I reading now about this old chicken or something like that?
So what was a scene that didn't quite make it that you wish you could have found a way to keep it in?
Yeah, well, some of it was, some of the later stuff, like from Africa, like I've done a lot of trips to Africa, been on a lot of safaris, a lot of humanitarian work. And the people that know me are like, why isn't there anything in here about this? We want to hear more about Africa. We want to hear more about those kind of stories. And I was just like, you know what? It's maybe for another book, but it just doesn't really fit in here. And then there's some of the stuff, from the older Steve stuff where, maybe it was like Little League Baseball, where the day that I got three triples in a game, or the day that I just kept fouling the ball off. My mom just, I was called Foul Ball Fredlund because I couldn't put the ball in play. And it was kind of this really funny story. You kind of get these nicknames. And there was some stuff I tried to relate to it, but it really didn't, And so, as I'm there as this little scrawny little, I don't know, 12-year-old kid with my red owl. I think it was a red owl sponsored the Little League baseball uniform, and kind of I got these pictures. It's just those are the kind of stories where it's like, oh, good memories, sweet memories, some not so sweet memories that I chose not to include. But I think part of the cathartic experience of writing a book is recalling all of the stuff that happened, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. But then, yeah, making it into the book, there really had to be kind of a discerning process and really being selective there.
I've enjoyed reading memoirs. It's a genre that I've discovered over the last few years. And I heard one author talk a little bit about how, as a memoir writer, you might need to take care of the people that you're bringing into your stories. And so I'm curious how you kind of balance the needs of the people in your life while you're trying to meet the needs of the reader and what the reader might expect from your memoir, especially when you're trying to tell the story of, do the unright thing and guide people with you.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting journey because, I don't consider myself a writer, so I relied really heavily on the editors and those that were involved in the process. And I think there's several people that you kind of, in your words, take care of during the process. I like how you phrase that. I mean, I'm taking care of myself as part of the process because, there's certain stories I don't share because I want to take care of myself. And then you're trying to take care of the people that you're talking about in the book and make sure that, you're giving them the right level of respect. You're not throwing anybody under the bus. You're not, doing anything that's going to, be a real negative in their life while still being honest to the story. But then, yeah, you're kind of, you're, how do I take care of the reader in this? How do I give them something that's actually going to be beneficial to them without making it too weighty? At least that was my vision. I didn't want to make this because, you can go dark. You can make things really kind of really tough to read. You can go down some holes that are just, oh, I don't really want to hear that. Or you don't want to, I didn't want to leave the reader wondering, is this guy okay? Like, this guy writing the book, is he actually okay? Should I be worried about him? So there is a kind of a modicum of taking care of everybody in the process. And so that was what I was trying to balance, kind of the three legs of the stool: take care of myself, take care of the others that I mentioned in the book, and then take care of the readers. And with the whole goal of, this isn't, some people try to memoir because they're famous, right? Okay, I mean, I'm a famous singer, I'm Madonna, I can just write a memoir. Whatever I write is going to sell, and I can tell whatever stories without even making a point. I'm not saying she didn't, but just, you can do that. I'm not that person. And so I was really trying to write it through the lens of one specific thing that I learned in my life, which was, you spend all your life putting everybody first, everybody first, everybody first, everybody first. For some of us, we wake up one day and we're like, this isn't even my life, or it's not even what I want to do in my life. And so, part of taking care of people is saying, this is the point I'm trying to make. And so for every story, just trying to draw back to that and write it in a way that people can find themselves in it. This isn't just about, hey, let's read a cool book about Steve. For some people it is, I guess, but it's really the way I wrote it. I'm trying to let people say, I remember that feeling, or I remember that kind of experience, or, that kind of thing.
So I really enjoyed this chapter title. And I have to tell you, I got the book, I turned to the table of contents and I just kind of browsed to the chapter titles. I was like, what does Weird Al have to do with trapping gophers? So tell us a little bit about this chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for a long time about this. And, I was a huge parody. I loved writing parodies. I loved listening to parodies. Weird Al Yankovic, for those who don't know, who are too young, he wrote parody music, and, everything from Michael Jackson, instead of Beat It, he wrote Eat It. And he had all these parodies. I just loved that concept. And when I was younger, I used to write parodies myself then. Like, my mom's typewriter in the basement, and I would type out songs, Dean's Hall, which is a parody of That's all these different things. He was like our janitor in the school. So I wrote all these parodies, and I loved Weird Al Yankovic. And I always wanted to get this new cassette that came out. He had a new cassette tape. If you don't know what that is, Google it. But, it's called Weird Al in 3D. And I just wanted this cassette so bad, but I didn't have the money to get it. And so luckily for me, about that same time, one of our neighbors, Tom and Ellie, who lived maybe a mile away or so, Tom offered me a buck of gopher to trap gophers out of his big yard. It was my love of Weird Al, my desire to get Weird Al in 3D, that made me trap gophers for a summer.
And you got the cassette, I hope.
I got the cassette. It was as good. It was as good as I'd imagined. I mean, just fantastic. And I have it in the book too, but I just sat there and listened to it. Like, is life any better than this? And for a lot of people, they're like, that's terrible. Like, that's, nobody, people that don't get into parody, don't get into Weird Al. He's kind of a love him or hate him kind of situation. But I loved parody so much, and it was the best day ever. Yeah.
And what I think is interesting is in your book, you're talking about how you used humor and you enjoyed creating humor, and you're a creative person.
Yeah.
And so it seemed like there was a period of time where you're trying to use humor and something you enjoy to be part of this doing the right thing.
Humor was kind of, I think it was both my outlet, and it was also my attempt at fitting in.
Hmm.
Because I was really scrawny. I mean, you look at me now and I'm way overweight, but I'm also pretty tall. But at the time I was really a scrawny kid. I lacked confidence, and I got picked on, and that kind of thing. And so how do you fit in school, which school can be really difficult? How do you fit in if you're not an athlete? I tried to play sports if you're not a, standout anything. And so for me, I think it was humor. And I think that actually helped me. I think that actually worked. So I would tell a lot of jokes. I would try to be, funny around people, just, I think, to help them think I was okay in a weird sort of
Hmm.
way. And so that's really how I used humor. But I always loved, to me, it was innate. Like I just loved being creative. I loved being funny. I loved practical jokes. I loved all of that kind of stuff. But in terms of fitting into society, I used that as a way to try to fit in. And I could tell even through my life, it's always sort of been there as a way of deflecting certain things as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that humor brings me a lot of joy, but I also use it as a tool to try to get out of situations that I don't really want to be in.
And what I also enjoyed was how you described in your book the way the validation from others kind of led you into your career. So you had a successful career, mathematician, statistician,
Mhm.
the skills that we all are told we should be achieving throughout high school. So, and that ended up being that validation piece, right? So, and I think a lot of us can appreciate that perspective that you share with us is the world is validating these things we're meant to do. And for you enjoyed the creative and the humor, but the world was validating the mathematics aspect of that.
Yeah, I mean, how practical is it to be funny? Like, can you ever make a living being funny? That's why Weird Al was like my hero because he had done it. But yeah, as I got older, and it was always surrounded by well-intentioned people, I was always good at math. It was one of the things I could always do. It was always easy for me. And so the obvious choice when I got to high school was, well, take calculus, take all the stuff that you can in rural Minnesota, and then of course I'm going to go to college and study math. Like I didn't even give it another thought. What else to study? It was just like, well, math. That's what I'm good at. That's what the teacher said I was good at. That's what the guidance counselor said I was good at. That's what I should do. So I went and studied math.
So that brings us to another favorite chapter of mine from your book, and that is being a carp sounds nice. And I honestly read this chapter title and thought, you know what? I feel that. I have felt that. It's just that need at some point to say, you know what, I just want to step back, not think, not worry about anything, just be there. But what's really interesting about this chapter is I came across Taylor Swift and I
Yeah.
thought of
Yeah.
all the times in in history, how does Taylor Swift and carp come in common in your story?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because I mean the whole parody writing, the creative stuff, the singing stuff was such a big part of my life when I was younger, but it had just been dampened, right? I mean, it just because of being professional and doing into math and all that stuff. But there's these times where it would pop up, sort of an unexpected sort of fashions, and I was going through it in this chapter. Like I was miserable, I was frustrated, I didn't know what to do. I had tried to figure out like, are there breathing exercises I can do, something to kind of alleviate the stress. And that's where I talk about in the chapter, if I remember it all right. But I was heading out of the office to go walk on the Stone Arch Bridge because I'd walk across there back and forth. This is in downtown Minneapolis, trying to figure out why I'm unhappy because it made no sense why I was unhappy. I couldn't understand this good life, why I was unhappy. And I was walking my way to the bridge, and this Taylor Swift like parody popped in my head. Like she's got the song Our Song, right? Where she's talking about, riding in the truck and the hair's undone and all this kind of stuff. And I just popped in my head this Taylor Swift parody, and I started singing it. I was walking downtown with my jacket on, breathing exercises through my nose or something like that. It was like, where is this coming from? But I think that's to me, I took it as sort of this symptom all along that it was just my creative side trying to come out, just always looking for outlets, always looking for a way to be creative, and I just kind of always would dampen it down. And so I don't know why it came out in that moment, but it just did. And I started like thinking about the whole Our Song and writing the whole parody in my brain with that. But yeah, that was on my way to walk across the Stone Arch Bridge where I was spending all my time, and that's where being a carp sounds nice comes in, because I looked down in the water a couple of the days and there's just like carp swimming around in the shore. And I was like, seems like a good life. I mean, when you start thinking the life of a carp is good, but just like I don't know, maybe they have stresses, maybe they're worried about their children. I don't know what a carp is actually thinking, but it just seemed like they were just kind of hanging out, swimming around together as a school of fish and not really worried about anything, at least in my mind. And so that's where I was like, huh, that seems nice.
I really enjoyed your memoir. I encourage everyone to get it if you don't have a copy yet. And I enjoyed it because we can see ourselves in that, especially for those of us who were raised in Minnesota. That tends to be a people-pleasing state if you were raised here. So I just enjoyed how you kind of brought it to you're doing the unright thing and how that's brought you some success in that way. So thinking about your path and your advice for others, what is that one piece of advice that you would like to give us to find our own right thing?
Yeah, I think it starts with really knowing the kind of experience you want to have in life. I talk about, realizing that life itself is an epic adventure. So many times we think of these adventures that we go on, whether it's a trip or a kid's birthday party or all these like fun things, and then the rest of life is just kind of the stuff that we have to do or waiting for the next exciting thing to happen. And I think the transition of our paradigm to realizing that life itself is the adventure is kind of a first step. But I think it's understanding what kind of life experience do you want to have. I think that is the advice. And I think that's really hard to do. And I'm not necessarily talking about what you actually do for a job. It's what kind of experience do you want to have? Do you want to have a life with more laughter? Do you want to have a life with more seriousness? More sunsets, more excitement? What kind of life experience do you want to have? And I think that was in the book, the question that changed everything for me was actually coming to grips with the fact that I didn't know. And I think that really is the linchpin piece behind all of that. So where does the unright thing come into that? Well, when we understand what kind of experience we want to have, then we can start making decisions that lead to that experience. We can start surrounding ourselves with the people that lead to that experience, putting ourselves in the situations, stopping doing certain things with certain people that don't lead to those experiences. And sometimes that requires us to do the unright thing because there's a set of norms that is the right thing to do. We're born into a family. There's a set of defaults. There's a set of things that we inherit in terms of what we're supposed to believe, what we're supposed to do, what we're supposed to think about, religion or politics or sex or the role of women or the value of education or guns or any of that stuff. We have all of this external voices that kind of tell us what we're supposed to think. But I think once we understand what kind of experience we want to have, we can start to do the unright thing, which is maybe go against some of those external pressures. And so the unright thing is really, it's sort of this weird sort of dynamic because it's unright in the eyes of what maybe other people think is the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to stay an actuary. The right thing to do is to, whatever it is, and you have to do the unright thing. But it turns out the unright thing in the eyes of others is the right thing for us.
That brings us to your book publishing, right? So you've shared a little bit about your journey so far and the journey you share in your book. So I was kind of curious when you decided that you wanted to write your story, your memoir.
Yeah, that's been an interesting journey too. So, it was, many, like 7 or 8 years ago, where I kind of wanted to write a book just for my own sake and for my kids' sake. And I started writing it, just had no point in it or whatever. And so I put it on the wayside. And then the whole impetus really to start writing a book was largely because I'd become a keynote speaker. And to get certain stages, to get noticed by certain bureaus, to get, all that kind of stuff, you need to have a book. Like for some of them, that's sort of this minimum requirement to be considered. And so that's where I'm like, maybe I do need to write a book. So I'll just admit that was kind of the initial reason behind it. And so I started writing. As I talked to people, I started writing a book from an expert's perspective. I was speaking about how do we be happier. So I started researching happiness like crazy. Like, how are we happier? And I started looking at the chemistry behind it and the psychology behind it. And I wrote like 75,000 words, which is like twice as much as the book I ended up with. And I had 70 different citations in like APA format, that terrible sort of research paper stuff you have to do. I had written the book and I just kept thinking, and this was like over the course of like 9 or 10 months. And I just kept thinking, talking about the experience that I really want. I don't want to be an expert in this. I'm not an expert in this. I don't want to be an expert in this. I don't want people approaching me like I'm an expert. I don't want to be giving talks like I'm some wizard on happiness. I'm just a guy who's trying to figure out how to be happier. That's all I am. And so I wrote that book, and I would work with different editors kind of along the way. And I expressed this, and I think largely they just kind of patted me on the head, like, well, suck it up. You're almost done. You got this, keep going. I'm just like, oh, this isn't what I want. And then I ran into somebody, and she kind of gave me permission to write the book that I really wanted to write. And so, when you're on the front end of writing a book, you really don't know what you want. You just start doing it. And then she started asking me questions, and it turned out like, this isn't the book I want. I really just want to write my story. She's like, write a memoir. I'm like, yeah, but I got this whole thing written. She's like, save it. Maybe you'll use it someday, but the research was valuable. What you learned about things is valuable. But if that's not even the direction you want to go, if that's not the experience you want to have, in a sense, she's like saying, do the unright thing.
Mm.
Scrap it, throw it away, put it on the cutting room floor, and write the book that you really want to write.
Yeah.
And so, long intro to that. So I started writing the memoir maybe 3 or 4 months before it was published. It was kind of a mad scramble a little bit, but yeah, so I wrote the actual memoir in probably about 3 to 4 months.
And did you find that research that you were doing, that it helped your memoir?
I think it did indirectly. It certainly helped me understand some things. I think it helped me connect some of the dots between some of my stories, because I did struggle with that a little bit. I'm like, okay, here's the story, the authentic version of the story. Here's the authentic version of this story. And I can't connect the dots. But then, yeah, going back to some of the research and understanding what maybe drives, the psychology of happiness and what even is happiness and some of that stuff did help me connect the dots. And I had to fight to not put it into my book, because I didn't want this to be a wizard's book,
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I think it helped me understand myself. It helped me understand how some things are connected, for sure.
Yeah. And so just thinking too about that editing process. I mean, you've mentioned your editor a couple times, and there's times when I've spoken with writers, and my husband's a writer, and I understand how difficult that can be, that editing process. So describe that process for you, and kind of what approach did you take with your editor in that stage?
Yeah, so they had, I worked with a publishing company, and so kind of this hybrid publisher, and so there's different editors along the way, and I don't remember what they're all, from structural editor to managing editor to copywriting to all these different things. I don't know. So it started with really kind of setting the outline. Once we decided we kind of did this, then we had to go back with the memoir perspective. What stories need to be told? And so we kind of outlined this whole thing. But then, yeah, as we got into the writing, I think there were some real big issues, like I talked about already, where some stories just got scrapped. Like, hey, good story doesn't advance the plot line. We got to scrap this. And there's a few times where there's arm wrestling and kicking and screaming and pouting, but they said ultimately it's my decision, but they were right. So there's some really good fun stories that aren't in there, but they're like, save that for the stage. That's not for the book. And so they were super helpful that way. Also really helpful, even though the struggle of, do you write it in first person, third person? Do you write it in past tense, present tense? All these other different tense, like all those things, because sometimes the way you have to write it isn't how you would say it. And so they helped kind of with some of that global language, like, how am I writing this? Am I writing this like it's happening right now? Am I writing it like it's happening in the past? And all of that. And then, as it got down further and further into the actual book, then you're into the nitty gritty, where they're kind of picking it apart and looking at word choices and that.
So now that you're doing what you love, what is the most difficult part of your artistic process, or your creative process?
The most difficult part. Oh, interesting question. So I would say, doing what I love right now is the keynote speaking. Like, that is what's taken over my world right now. That's what I'm doing almost exclusively is keynote speaking, and I love it. I just love it. I think the hardest part is I'm continuing to work. It's kind of the same talk I do each time. I'm kind of always tweaking it, kind of always improving it a little bit, trying to make it a little more fun, a little more engaging, a little more compelling. The hardest part is I have a million ideas, and so it's really been an exercise in patience for me and discipline to say, no, this is what I do. I deliver this talk. It's a really good talk. People really are moved by the talk. And yeah, keep tweaking, keep improving, make it a little bit better around the fringes, but don't get away from the middle here, because that's what, my artistic side, my creative side wants to just do all kinds of different stuff. And so this has been a good thing. And I think frankly, because I've had good results, it reinforces that. Like if things weren't moving well, I would be constantly reinventing myself. But I think this is a good exercise. So it's, I guess to answer your question, it's finding the way to be creative and have those outlets within the context of what is working for the business.
Well, we are thrilled to have you, and we thank everyone for joining us today. Steve, congratulations on your memoir. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone who gets their hands on it does read it a couple times because there's a lot of good lessons in there. So thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on here.